I'm Rachel. I'm a worship leader and a member of the worship ministry's leadership team. I am so excited for the worship ministry to be doing the home group series Made to Worship. Over the next few weeks, you're going to meet a whole bunch of members of our worship leadership team who are all going to tell you about different aspects of what it means to worship God. Today's the first session where we're going to be talking about why we worship. Worship is so much more than the first 30 minutes of your Sunday service. It is so much more than your soundtrack into church on a Sunday morning in the car when you're running a little bit late. It's so much more than just singing songs. It involves changing the way that we do life. It involves reshaping our lifestyle. It involves reordering our priorities so that God is in the center of all that we do. If it's so weighty, and it's so hard, and it's so costly, then why do we do it? Now, there are a lot of false reasons that we worship. Sometimes we worship just because we're going through the motions, or because we had a really charismatic preacher or worship leader who inspired you and stirred your heart to get you to worship. Or maybe it's because you think God is not being worshipped enough, and so you pity him, and so you're like, okay, God, here you go, I'm gonna worship you. Or because you think that we need to prop God up, like he is not the most important being in the entire universe. Obviously, this is not the case. You see, we do not make the first move by worshiping God. Rather, he made the first move by loving us and showing us his mercy. And we worship in response to that. In order to fully comprehend what God has done, we first need to understand how desperately we need a Savior. Now, we live in an incredibly sinful, increasingly secular world that has really normalized sin. I remember growing up in church and thinking that just everything was a sin, right? Like you cheat on your math test and that's a sin. Or you steal a candy bar from the grocery store and that's a sin. Right, but I think when we think of sin like that, we actually downplay its true weight. Romans tells us that all have sinned and fall short, and that the wages of sin are death. And sin is a crime that's actually so foul and so disgusting that the only possible recompense is the literal Son of God. And so this way that we can sometimes think of sin as this cheap thing or this set of rules that we're meant to follow, it's false. It's false. We are so sinful. Our society is so sinful. And that is a big deal. That is why we need a Savior. Once we understand how desperately we need the Savior, it helps put into perspective the sacrifice that God enacted when he sent Jesus to die on the cross for us. Once we understand it deeply, it's like the woman with the alabaster jar, right, who has this very expensive perfume that she breaks over the feet of Jesus, and that she washes his feet with her literal hair, because she truly understands how desperately she needs him and how incredible it is to merely be in his presence, despite what the onlookers would say, despite what the Pharisees would say, despite what everyone must be thinking about her. On top of all this, God continues to meet us in our everyday lives. Today's focus song is Amazing Grace, and I'm sure you know the lyrics, but just as a recap, it goes, Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. And when John Newton wrote this back in the 1770s, he had actually walked away from Christ, and he wasn't a very good guy, to be honest. He was a sailor that was known for having a way with foul words and for abandoning the ship a couple times and that kind of stuff. And there was one day that he was on this ship and there was this big storm that sort of came. And he cried and he prayed for the first time in a long time, and he begged God for mercy. And God rescued the ship. He ended up being safe, and he not only penned Amazing Grace, the most famous hymn in all the world, but he also dedicated the rest of his life to serving God. And he became a reverend, penning many more hymns and teaching many people about Christ. You see, he understood what it meant for God to save him and for God to show him his mercy on top of the saving of his sins. And he reacted in the only way that's appropriate, which is to dedicate his life to worshiping him.